about the project from two of the main researchers on the project, namely Jill Berrick, who is visiting from the University of Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, and Marit, who is the director of DIPA. You met her already, some of you, and who is a professor of political science at the University of Berkeley. And I would just like, so I'm very pleased to also actually be part of this project, which I'm looking very much forward to. But for now, I just wanted, really, Marit, I wanted you to start saying something about why this project and what are we going to do? And then we can go back and forth.
Jill and I, we have reordered since I've already been at the scene, but that's good. So this is a super exciting project, which is called Child Protection Across the World. So we have absolutely huge ambitions, and we're going to give you just a tiny bit of a teaser of that today. And thank you also so much for just hanging on here. It's 12:30, and we had some really good session already today. So thank you for that. And Jill, I will send the baton over to you.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for reiterating what Marit said. Thanks for hanging in there for a few minutes. This has been a very exciting conference, talking about rights, who has rights, what are enforceable rights, when do we want to acknowledge individuals' rights. And so we're going to shift the conversation for just a few minutes to children and children's rights. Okay, thank you so much. And we're going to be talking a little bit about some work we have done and how that then shifts us into the future. So Marit and Neil Gilbert, also UC Berkeley, and I are publishing a book coming out later this fall called the Oxford Handbook of Child Protection Systems. It's edited by us and it's being published by Oxford University Press. And it's designed to look at 50 countries across 6 continents and their child protection systems and what we can learn from that. So next. There we go, and there it is. So let me just set some context. We want to be clear. Parents, family, kin, tribes raise children. No matter where you live, that's the normative standard, and they do so magnificently, and they do so against the odds, as we've all talked about over the last several days. But under some conditions, some narrow circumstances in all countries, children sometimes find themselves without an ally, without a protector, without a champion. And so in those circumstances, when parents, kin, tribes are unable to care for kids, unwilling to care for kids, the state typically steps in. So what's interesting is if you look across the entire globe, every country has laws designed to protect children when circumstances break down in the family network, or with the tribe. In general, most people in most of those countries would say that those systems are inadequate. In general, most people in most of those countries would say those systems are under-resourced. And in general, in most countries, we would all say that there are flaws in all of those systems of one kind or another. But nevertheless, everyone is trying to do something to care and protect children across the world. And these are contested issues in every single country because parenting itself is such a normative practice. It's based upon different cultures, different norms, different strategies, different views about how we raise kids. And so child protection is very thorny area to think about children and what their rights are vis-a-vis their parents and the community, what parents' rights are vis-a-vis their children and the community. So let me just remind all of us that we have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which does set this another context, which is children do have individual rights. And all of the countries across the globe, except for my fair country, the United States, have ratified the convention. So everyone is taking this convention very seriously. And we have 20 countries now that have actually changed their constitution to incorporate the UN Convention into their constitutional context. So there's no question that the trend is many countries are looking to the UNCRC as a framework for saying children have individual rights. So where do we see that and how do we see that showing up in child protection systems? In our project, we're looking across the world, as I said, and of course there's variability. We would expect to see variability, but what we're looking for is trends and patterns. What do these patterns tell us about the different ways that different countries organize child protection and respond to children and their individual rights? Where we should expect to see variability because of the underlying history, culture, values of each country. But we also see that each country thinks about children and child protection entirely differently. It's come up earlier this week. What is childhood? What's the definition? What's the age range? What is harm? What is risk of harm? Who is harmed? What is the state's responsibility? When is it our responsibility? What should we do? These are all the dimensions, plus many more, that sort of characterize what a child protection system could look like. And so we've been looking for the patterns across countries to characterize the differences in these dimensions. Our work follows work by other scholars from the past who have previously done this, largely looking at European-centered systems. So Neil Gilbert, back in 1997, thank you, did the first analysis where he looked at European-centric countries and the US, and he essentially said you can divide the world into two groups, family service groups and child protection service groups. He then expanded that work another 10, 12 years later, including Marit, Skivenes, Nigel Parton, and they came up with 3 systems: family service oriented, child protection oriented, and child-centric oriented. But those analyses, as helpful as they were very, as I said, European-centric. So other authors have come in to really look more at low and middle income countries. So Connolly and her associates took this concept of creating 4 general archetypes of child protection, which you can see on the slides here. And then they went out to find countries that might be emblematic of these 4 approaches. So one was an inductive approach, as in Connolly, others was deductive. What we've done now is take those ideas and build upon them, looking at 50 countries across the globe. And what we're seeing is 5 types. And of course, this is the beginning of the debate, right? We set out a typology and your job is to tell us why we're wrong. But that's exactly what we're trying to understand here with the next project. So what we've identified is 5 types, each one embedded in the type before it. So these are concentric circles, which suggest that in some countries, depending upon how you define childhood, depending upon how you define risk, and importantly, depending upon the resources available in that country to respond to harm, they're trying to optimize different protective response for children. So it might start with this notion of just trying to protect kids from exploitation. In the next concentric circle, just trying to protect children from fundamental deprivation. Then you might move to another concentric circle, which is maltreatment oriented, whatever that might be. Then you might move to a more expansive version of protecting well-being. And finally, to the most expansive version we see, which is protecting children's rights, which include all of the previous concentric circles, but is the most expansive. So our typology looks at 10 dimensions, 5 dimensions of the state itself, and 5 dimensions of the protective system itself to characterize each country as belonging to one of these types. That then takes us to the next project, which is what this is about, which is to look at whether or not we can empirically test the typology. What are the ways in which we can design research strategies to actually examine whether a state falls into one typology or not, whether these lines are porous or they are static, and whether or not the typologies themselves actually hold. So that's what our approach is in this new project with the 3 of us, which is going to be very, very exciting. And we're happy to take your questions. Your questions.
So thank you, Jill. This was an amazing sort of tour through a large literature. But Marit, now I want you to sort of tell a little bit more about the strategy and the project. So how are we going to find, how are we going to test this empirically?
Yes, thank you, Siri, and thank you so much, Jill. It was an excellent outline of the project and the typology. So what to do, how to test this typology. And we have, as Jill showed us and told us, we have different dimensions that we think are creating the patterns of a child protection system. And as we have spoken about during this conference, and also that we know so much about when it comes to children and the lived lives, this is a normative question. There's something about the values, there's something about what is important for people, and this differs immensely. So our thinking and idea is that we need to examine what people think. What are the culture, or what are the normative bases across the world for how to understand what is harm to a child? How much should a child endure before you think that someone needs to make an intervention, or it should be a responsibility of the state to do something about it? And of course, then also, as Jill pointed out, it is not necessarily an ability to do something, even though if you want to do something, you don't have the tools and the measures and the resources to do it. And also another debate, which we'll not enter into here, is that do we actually have the proper tools and programs and measures to help families provide for their children? So, but going back to our first part of the project, we want them to do examinations of representative samples of the populations, and we have actually aimed for 75 countries, which is huge and of course enormously costly. And we want to then to suggest for them some of the core dilemmas within child protection. And that could be, one example would be the right orientation. So how strong would people think about parental rights up against children's rights? Because now we are in that very, very small area of child protection, which is very different from kind of the ordinary kind of childhood family, but we are within child protection, in which there are actually the parents that are not able to or not willing to provide for their children. So we want them to create some dilemmas, and we aim to use vignette methods to try to tease out what people think about it. Another example could be to look at the concept of family. And you can just, because when you have to remove a child, which you sometimes have to do in child protection, you can think, so how long should the child stay with a new family before you think that that is the child's new family? Or should we also always have a norm that the child should be returned to the birth parents or the natural parents? So there is kind of, and people differ on these values and what is right and what is not right to do. We want to tease out these ideas and norms about families and about values, and then of course all the other patterns that we have identified in our typology. And I do also think that we expect that some of it will fall. But that will of course also be an interesting part of it. Yes, we have also a second part, but I wonder if we should kind of play a little bit back and forth, because we have also a legal part of it. Yeah. So should I kind of take
I think you could.
Yeah.
Yes, you could do that. No, well, we could, because I think one of the issues that are raised when it comes to this, to trying to assess sort of values and attitudes is, of course, to how is it's the fundamental question in compared to research, but it becomes really, really acute when we have such a large and broad sample of countries, and also when it comes to issues that are really, really strongly culturally embedded. So how do we meaningful ask questions? How to go about assessing this in a way that doesn't sort of impose our understandings within the question? So how to approach that, and how to actually deal with that in the best possible way. Could you say something about sort of how to develop these vignettes and how to make sure that they are
how they actually measure what they are supposed to measure?
Yeah, but also, I mean, how do we get what is relevant in the different contexts?
Yeah, exactly. So, and that is, of course, you are pointing out some very, very difficult
that's my job.
dilemmas that we will meet. So of course, just kind of with all kind of, we need to test it and do all those kind of steps that you have to do to make a valid vignette and a valid questions that are also transferable over societies. And of course, translations, which we have already a lot of knowledge about how difficult that is, that you actually are able to capture what is in the language, and that it simultaneously are similar across countries. Yeah. So that is absolutely some of the different. But I also want to then add on, that is, we want to also look at Supreme Court judgments within these countries, which also will give us then some of that local kind of identification of what is important and what are kind of the key decisions that are influencing the society. Because we do know that even though there are variation in how law functions and how Supreme Court has an influence, it's still something which is usually have an importance in society. So, and then I will throw it back to you. Actually.
No, do you want to add to that?
Just to say that we've had some experience with this in the past, doing some research in Finland, Norway, the United States, Ireland, oh goodness, Estonia. You could list their Spain. So some of the strategies that we've used in the past is in developing a very, very short vignette, because the longer it is, the more complicated things get and the more people's imagination goes in many different directions. To make it grounded in themes and experiences that are very familiar to child protection staff across countries. So always verifying with child protection staff that this does resonate in some way, and then bringing it out to a sample of the public as well, to get a sense of when you read this, what did it say to you? So there are some strategies that we've employed in the past that we'll obviously try to use going forward.
Thank you. I just think this is because there are many students there and scholars who are trying to do comparative work, and I think this is something that is sort of fundamentally difficult and very striking in this particular project. So, Marit, you say that we're going to analyze the judgments. Could you just say? Also, I will open up for questions, so you can line up, but if you have questions. But I wanted you to say a little bit more about the analytical approach to the judgment. So what we will do, how will we analyze the judgment?
Yeah, thank you. So we will, as I said, collect and try to identify the main judgment within different societies. And there we need help from legal scholars, and we need to have help from the legal communities, so that we are actually able to identify what are the case law and what are the key judgments. But in addition, we are also aiming to interview judges across these societies, so that we can give some insight into how they are working and what would be the important dimensions to look at. And that will also, of course, then include how they would interpret the legislation within their context. And this is just based on the few comparative studies that we have done, including different legislation and the judicial part of the system. It's not, in my experience at least, it's not easy to actually identify what are kind of the logic of the judiciary. So yeah, so I do absolutely, and we are absolutely very much aware that this is a challenging part, but at the same time, we do also have a huge network and a lot of competent people that would point us in a direct direction and also give us some assistance. Yeah. So this is probably also an invitation, I would say. Yeah.
No, I think, and I do think that it's important to sort of, legal systems vary so much, so you need to have deep knowledge of the legal system to make sense of it. So it's, as you're saying, we rely on a big family, big network. Okay, so we'll take, I think, this is probably oh, there it is, okay. I think you can just start talking, and then the very able technician who's been aiding us all along, he will make sure it works.
So one question I had is, I'm curious to know who your audience is for this book. Is it mostly practitioners? Because it sounds like it's like best practices and what you can learn from different examples and commonalities among these 75 different countries' networks. And the second is, you mentioned this tension, I think, Marit, you mentioned this tension between parental rights and children's rights and the extent to which that tension plays a role in defining the various children's services in these various countries. And I'm curious to know about another potential tension with communal rights and the extent to which that informs the very structure and nature and framework of the children's services in these various countries. So for example, in America, like there's a spotlight now on Native American countries, and there's a whole different framework for addressing children in Native American communities. So just curious about that.
So we address that in the current book, and we'll be addressing that in our future work as well. So that we do generally think of this as a binary between children and parents, but it's actually much more complicated than that, depending upon the country you live in. And so the tribe or the community, however it might be characterized in a particular country, is a very prominent actor, depending upon the country and the context. And so we don't limit ourselves to only children. We don't limit ourselves to parents. And the ways in which tribes or communities or clans or groups exert themselves and exert their rights are highly influential in a particular state's child protection system. So that's certainly accounted for in our current work. So that I'm really glad you raised that issue. The second is that the audience is probably more policymakers than practitioners. And that is that the current work is really designed to help policymakers think through what are our fundamental principles? What is this system that we have built over however many years that has all sorts of foibles and difficulties and challenges associated with it? What are the principles upon which it has been built and we want it to be built? And as we build it further into the future, given resources and context and culture, are there patterns that we see from other countries or other types that we can then aspire to? And so the design is really around when we better see ourselves within a type, does that help us understand what we're aiming for or perhaps what we're quite comfortable with? So it's not designed to say there's a should, but there are opportunities for reform. And so looking at typologies helps a country and the policymakers within that country orient themselves to the dimensions of the reform that they might want to pursue.
Yes, and just to add to that, I think it's also, of course, of relevance for the academics, just kind of to sort out when you are examining countries and want to compare them. And just to give a kind of a pointer to a discussion later on, I think that you see exactly what you're saying, Jill, when it comes to child marriage. So you see kind of the role of kind of the wider community, or kind of you see the very strong force of the culture there, which is of course important. Yes, so thank you.
And also, I mean, it also plays into this question of what is a family, because of course that's also part of this, which is very culturally embedded.
I guess so. I realize your book is mostly empirical, but it obviously raises some very, very critical, and the more I think of it, actually incredibly impossibly difficult questions, theoretical questions. And it's so interesting to have this panel straight after the one that we've had. And immediately I'm thinking about the issue of the residential schools in Canada. So the state deciding what was best for the children and imposing that paradigm on them in their best interests. So that is an example, of course, of how the state can go so terribly wrong. But on the other hand of the equation, you've got the issue of nuclear families, which I feel are just not deconstructed enough, not critiqued enough, the tremendous harm of the nuclear family. And this is not just in terms of harm to children, but also in terms of gender-based violence, etc. So I think, you know, this is really a fault line between two systems of harm and how to figure out what's the best way forward for the children. So really, really important work. Thanks.
Just a comment about that, because I appreciate that this is sort of a central, very, very thorny area for research and for practice. And part of the work that Marit and I have done previously is to examine public opinion about some of these questions and to see the degree to which public opinion aligns with state policy. So part of what you're describing is we have so many historical examples of the state gone awry. We have so many historical examples across all of our countries where the state imposed harm on communities and upon families, and none of us feel good about that, and all of us want to right those wrongs, and if ever possible. But going forward, the more that we can align policy with the public's views about the right approach to responding to these circumstances that are harmful to individuals, then we would hope that we would see policies that are more responsive to the communities that they serve. And so that is part of the thinking behind this, is that when we go to the public in these various countries, and then we sort of compare the public's views about the way it should be compared to the public policy of the way it is, that those differences, that perhaps there are ways in which we can sort of start to narrow some of those differences so that the state response, when the response is required, is much more aligned with community values and community views about appropriateness, appropriate responsive family practices.
Yes, and I think that this is a great pointer, and of course also there is here a dimension, the historical view of children. That children has been, as you say, is a part of the family, and it's been kind of, we have women's rights and we have then children's rights coming up, and the dangers of being in a family and in this private sphere, and we have seen that in some of the discussions that we had here in the conference also, that this is now disputed, kind of who should decide over the family members. But what the UN have done just recently is that they have then said that they should not necessarily ban residential units, just going into that very specific historical part, but they now want it to be family homes, and it should be foster homes, so it should be a family-like place to at least kind of let foster children, and that is a huge difference as well. So there is, I think, an increasing recognition of children as individuals, and children as more on an equal footing of other individuals in societies.
So I think this also speaks a lot to this this is such an emotional field everywhere, and it raises particular challenges for research. I just think it's very fascinating coming sort of from the outside and into this research to see like how many emails, even if you're just a little bit involved, I don't want to think about what you're getting, how much you're part of people's emotional life and also vilified as a researcher. So I just wanted you, actually, since you've been in this so long, I just wanted you to reflect a little bit on strategies of navigating as a researcher, fields that sort of where people feel that you're either the enemy or the ally, and that you're sort of where you're really, really in this emotional. So it's in a way, we talked about this earlier, it's an ideological war in some ways, but it's also a deeply, deeply emotional field for so many people.
What did Salman say the other day when we had lunch? This is a lose-lose. Right? This field that we work in every day is a lose-lose. There are very few happy endings. There are very few rainbows and balloons. Kids have a tremendously difficult start for those who are harmed by their families, and the state response is frequently inadequate to their needs. Parents often feel as though the state response was unjust. Sometimes it was, sometimes it was not, but the perception remains. The public doesn't understand most of this field because it's extremely complicated. There are many, many actors involved. And child welfare workers are the ones, researchers have it easy. Child welfare professionals are the ones who are doing this work day to day with children, with parents, with communities, trying to align all of their needs and respond to all of their needs simultaneously, and usually falling short. So that's not a good answer to the question. It's just it's a very real response to the fact that this research area is fraught and sometimes very, very difficult.
And I just wanted to add, but thank you, Jill, for saying that, because of course it is the frontline workers and the judges that are making these decisions that are in the really, really kind of, in the, what do you say, between a rock and a stone, or yeah, it is rough, and complicated. And I think that for us as researchers, we are really privileged to be able to work in this field, because there is, I think that most of you, when we start dig into it, you see that there are so many interesting and difficult, both theoretical, conceptual, and empirical questions. So that is of course interesting, and I think that we have sometimes the privilege of speaking with service users and with parents and with the children, and that is usually very, very interesting. And sometimes they are really, really angry, and that is also something that we are usually able to handle. But I have to say that there is an ongoing project in Ireland, and then bringing it back to the social workers, in which there is a really rough time for them with the social media, which has just increased according to this project a lot. So it's just much, much tougher to be in the front line, because they are getting a lot of just being on Facebook and being where they are then. Yes. So thank you for that.
So thank you both. Our time is up, but you'll be back. So as this project is progressing, but thank you very much. Thank you for listening. It's lunchtime. We're back in about an hour. So thank you so much.